Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Brandi Geurkink, Senior Campaigner at Mozilla and your host for today's panel. We have a vital discussion planned for today as part of our MozFest Dialogues and Debates series. We're going to unpack an issue that's underpinning so many of the problems online and offline today: the relationship between AI and truth. The AI powering our most influential communications platforms has a critical vulnerability. It rewards engagement, not truth or civility. The result can be that misinformation, harassment, and polarization have massive speed, spread at massive speed and scale. To give you just one example, a couple of years ago, advocacy group Hope Not Hate analyzed 5,000 anti-Meghan Markle tweets and found that only 20 accounts were responsible for sharing 70% of negative tweets containing abusive pictures, hashtags, and memes. We're seeing similar abuse proliferate now in the aftermath of the interview that Meghan and Prince Harry did with Oprah. And many of these racist and abusive tweets are then retargeted to the Black community, meaning the harassment spreads even further than its original target. We're going to unpack this and lots more today. And we're also going to ask, can AI be designed differently to avoid this pitfall? If so, what conditions and incentives must be changed for this to be the case? I'm super excited to announce a group of amazing panelists that are joining me here today. So first off is Jacquelyn Mason, a senior investigative researcher at First Draft. Her research focuses on disinformation targeting Black and Latinx communities. Second is Mutale Nkonde, CEO of AI for the People, which explores how artificial intelligence technology can be used for the social good. Third is Dr. Krafft, a senior lecturer and MA Internet Equalities course leader at the UAL Creative Computing Institute. And finally, Rasha Abdul-Rahim, director of Amnesty Tech, a globally distributed team at Amnesty International, working to ensure technology benefits rather than erodes human rights. One last thing before we dive in, we're taking questions for this panel in real time, so tweet them at Mozilla with the hashtag dialogues and debates. So to kick off, I first want to pose a question to Mutale. Your groundbreaking research into ADOS, or American Descendants of Slavery online network, gave way to a new term in the disinformation space called disinformation creep, which refers to a general phenomenon wherein marginalized communities whose interests and legitimate grievances are ignored by mainstream narratives are then targeted by misinformation narratives. Can you tell us a little bit more about this research, Mutale, as well as its reception?
When I'm not muted. Yes, sure. And thank you for inviting me, everybody. So about 2 years ago, prior to even AI for the People starting, I was really kind of shocked and stunned that the most targeted group of online users in 2016 had been African Americans. And this was a finding of the Mueller report that was looking into election interference at that point. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in 2020 was to try and figure out what did that look like? What could that look like in 2020? And at that time, in 2016, it had been Russian troll farms creating fake social media communities like Woke Blacks, Brown and Down, other groups, and then creating content that was targeted to Black communities. But one of the things that we did this year was to try and find out what were the dominant Black narratives in the age of COVID, and expecting to find that in online spaces, we would be thinking about COVID as a racial justice issue. And with the particular network, what we did find was that they were using breaking news, specifically breaking news around culture and nativism. So lots of questions about who was really Black. Kamala Harris being kind of what piqued our initial interest, and conversations about her not being Black. And then really turning the corner to have other conversations around reparations was really the big conversation in 2020, but they would always end with, and then don't vote in the presidential. And this is really in line with traditional definitions of disinformation offered by Elizabeth Bittman and other KGB officers, where it was this truth, racism does exist, this lie that you have to have a particular birthright to be considered Black politically in America. That's not true. Ask, Amadou Diallo, who was shot by the police here in New York City in 1999. He was Black enough to be shot by the police, right? Even though he was from Guinea. And then this manipulation of behavior, which was don't vote. So our data set was 3.8 million tweets, but the universe that we looked at was 1.3 million tweets starting November 2019 through to election week. And we saw a clear pattern of what we believe to be networked activity pushing Black people to the right on the Twitter platform, but using this kind of disinformation creep strategy, which would be, hey, Kamala Harris is running for president. Oh, and by the way, she's not Black. Oh, and therefore don't vote for her. And then when she was named vice president, by extension, don't vote for the Academy, which we thought was interesting. But what really got us was when, unfortunately, Chadwick Boseman died, who for any Black person in any corner of the earth is the Black Panther. Wakanda is a real place. Don't ask us about it. We're going with it. And their tweets around that were like, well, that kind of serves him right because it was in Africa. And if he was a true American, then he wouldn't have been in the movie. So don't vote. At which point we were like, aha, we have something. And we were very specifically looking at how they were targeting a local news ecosystem in the Philadelphia news ecosystem. So it was quite a ride. And then lastly, in terms of reception, the internet was really mad. Like people that identified with that hashtag came after us. One of my co-authors had to block 600 accounts. One of my other co-authors got threats. Another person that we cite, she's told us that people prior to this had actually turned up at her house, doxing her, and that activity re-upped. So we were lucky to be connected to folks at Twitter through great relationships with Rasha and her team and their colleagues at Amnesty USA, and start a conversation. And I just found out today that I'm still being shadow banned by what I suspect to be that group. So if you receive a tweet from me like Beyonce should have got album for the year, and I still, I still don't care about the Grammys, you're going to find a warning on that tweet saying that this is sensitive content. So it's an ongoing conversation with the platform.
Thanks, Mutale. And you talked about how the kind of outcome of that was, and so don't vote, and so linking back to this kind of narrative and is being perpetuated. And Jacquelyn, I think in reviewing some of your research on, which is different, you looked at vaccine misinformation, but I think I saw sort of similar threads there with the ability for these messages to sort of reinforce a particular narrative. And I know you looked into vaccine misinformation in the Philippines, and I was wondering what you could tell us about the interplay between misinformation that spreads on social platforms and the wider media ecosystem that contributed to these narratives. Are you seeing any similar trends play out with COVID vaccine misinformation? Do you have any recommendations on how we should consider this problem?
Okay, great. Thank you, Brandi. Thank you for inviting me here. So excited to talk with all of you. So I will talk a little bit about my research on dengue fever in the Philippines that I did a couple of years ago. So for those of you not familiar, dengue is a viral infection in tropical and subtropical climates, and it is currently the most rapid spreading mosquito-borne viral disease in the world. So in November of 2017, Sanofi, which is a pharmaceutical company, developed a drug called Dengvaxia, which was meant to prevent dengue fever. However, shortly after, Sanofi released an updated analysis on Dengvaxia, but only after it had been administered to thousands of Filipinos. Basically, the analysis suggested that children who'd never been exposed to dengue, who would take Dengvaxia, could then develop a more serious form of dengue. And that more serious form of dengue could even lead to death, considering how dangerous Dengvaxia is. So dengue vaccinations were officially suspended in the Philippines shortly thereafter. This also led to a rapid decline in vaccine confidence among Filipinos. And years following the incident, there was still a lack of clear consensus from the actual government or the medical community in the Philippines. So this really encouraged a cacophony of voices and claims online and conspiracies that Dengvaxia was dangerous. And they began to thrive online, particularly on Facebook, buoyed by this hashtag called Denggate, right? This was a very popular hashtag used to associate misinformation about Dengvaxia with dengue to proliferate online. And this was a huge trauma for the Philippines. There were videos that were repurposed showing mass deaths, mass graves, people, in hysterics over the death of many children. So online, anti-vaccine social disinformation agents were basically thriving off of this. And they attached the deaths of thousands of Filipinos, if not hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, to Dengvaxia. And a majority, if not all of the posts, not being taken down, actually not really many taken down until recently in the wake of COVID-19. So 4 years later, some of those accounts are still up. A lot of those posts have been taken down. However, those spreading vaccine mis and disinformation are still using death and in a lot of cases, depopulation as a main talking point. So as we know, I think last month, Facebook pledged to crack down on COVID-19 vaccine misinformation. And while some posts have been taken down, false claims continue to proliferate on the platform. For example, people are using BitChute to have links about COVID-19, which spread false information that thousands of people have died. Even numbers as high as 56,000 people have died from vaccines, right? And these have been pushed over 1,300 times since the ban. Posts which claim people, specifically celebrities, have died or become ill from COVID vaccines remain on the platform, specifically surrounding Hank Aaron, especially within the Black community, especially within the Nation of Islam and other groups are spreading mis and disinformation that remains on the platform that Hank Aaron has died from COVID vaccines. Now, some of these posts are labeled by the CDC, but it's just truly not enough, right? They need to be taken down, but they are not, and they continue to proliferate. So as we know, there are informed sources, particularly on Facebook, that reach users' contents about vaccines, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Like, yes, they have the CDC and WHO posts, but it's not enough. These pages are often eclipsed by much conspiratorial content. And so I just think that my suggestion is that health authorities and trusted news sites be trained, much like we do with community-based organizations at First Draft, in best practices on social media monitoring, debunking disinformation and propaganda, and responsible reporting on these hoaxes in this age of disinformation.
Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. Yeah, and I think I definitely want to dive into sort of some questions I have around, digging in a little bit more on what community-based solutions to misinformation look like. I think we can definitely start to discuss that in just a few. I want to direct now to Peaks. Dr. Krafft, you're currently recruiting for a master's program in internet equalities focused on exploring how power relations are organized. This is like sort of a meta look, right, at some of the things that we've already been talking about, how they are embedded and perpetuated in internet technologies, and how they can be reorganized and challenged through critical, creative, activist practice. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how the course came about, who it's designed for, the change that you think it can bring about within the industry. We've already heard a couple of examples of areas where change is really, really needed. So I'm hoping you can speak to this a bit. And also if there are any particular emerging issues with regards to algorithmic equity that this course will explore.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brandi, and lovely to be here. as you mentioned, I think that what we've heard so far, there are all really great examples of the types of things that this course is trying to respond to. I think bullying and harassment online, bullying and harassment in the tech industry or in higher education, misinformation in various different domains, as well as AI bias, which I suppose we'll talk about more in a little bit. And these are all examples of how power is organized, embedded, and perpetuated. Power relations are organized, embedded, and perpetuated in information technologies. And the degree is really about what can we do and what kind of creative or critical or activist practice can address these things. It's a really unique opportunity and one that I'm really excited about because for the last few years, I've increasingly been participating in tech activism and just trying to make my day job as much about that as I can. And so the Creative Computing Institute at the University of the Arts London is a really unique place to be developing a program, because as an art school that has a lot of activist faculty members and a lot of kind of activist orientation in the institution, it's a real opportunity to do more than just teaching or learning together, but also really trying to learn by doing and orient the entire program as much as possible towards actually some of the social change that I hope we talk more about today. And yeah, I think that there's a wide range of folks who are engaged in this kind of work in tech activism. I hope that folks, designers interested in design justice, programmers interested in surveillance capitalism, social scientists, artists, activists who are concerned about tech or tech reporters, folks who are working in AI ethics, responsible innovation, tech policy, labor organizing. I think a lot of these sectors are represented here today, and all of these different areas and folks have different pieces to contribute to this conversation. And so the types of changes that I'm hoping to see, and also, I mean, I think the types of changes I'm hoping to see and the issues I think that are emerging are actually quite closely related. And so to address both of those, I would say I'm looking for broader understanding of social issues and the logics of collective action, protest, resistance, and refusal in the tech industry. Taking more, or having a culture of taking more personal responsibility, as well as developing networks of accountability to help myself and help us all to take that personal responsibility. Really opening up to pluralistic modes of knowledge production and thinking about different kinds of expertise and the kinds of expertise that come from all of our lived experiences, and doing work, whether it's research or design or engineering, that begins not with a research question or a problem formulation, but that begins with a theory of social change.
Thank you so much. I really admire how thoughtfully you're thinking about these issues and also solutions to these issues. And I think that each one of you actually has kind of a different approach to thinking about, I suppose, the angle at which you're working on these issues from, which is fascinating to dive into more. I wanted to ask Rasha, for you and your team at Amnesty, you've done a lot of great work to explore how the business models of corporate giants like Google or Facebook are actually at odds with human rights. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit, explain it to us. And in particular, as a campaigner, I'm really interested in, whether you think that there is a different approach that we should take when we're thinking about pressuring private companies to implement, more trustworthy AI, or versus, governments or public institutions. What do you think?
Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you so much for having me at this event and with such amazing fellow speakers. And I apologize if there's any background noise. The neighbors have decided to start doing a whole ton of work just now, just as I'm doing this event, but hopefully it's not too noisy. And thank you for your question, Brandi. I mean, there's so many things that I can say on this topic, but I'll start off by talking about how we analyze the business model of Google and Facebook from a human rights perspective, and what conclusions we reached, and then I'll move on a little bit to talk about what needs to be done, because I think that's really the crux of the issue here. I think we all know what the problem is, right? But what do we do about it? And I'm going to suggest a a bit of perhaps a radical response to what needs to be done. So in 2019, we published a report called Surveillance Giants, which basically looked at how the business model of Google and Facebook works and what the human rights risks are in relation to the business model. And what we analyzed was basically that these platforms are optimized, they're designed to optimize three things: how long they can keep us engaged, keep our eyes on the screens, how many users they can get, and how much ad revenue they can generate from serving ads to people whose eyes are on those screens. And this basically feeds the underlying business model, which is essentially to harvest and monetize our very intimate personal information. And the fundamental characteristic is to aggregate vast amounts of data on people, to keep them on the platform for as long as possible, and use that data to infer incredibly detailed profiles of people's lives and behavior, and then monetize this by selling those predictions, those profiles, to whoever wants to influence us. And we warned in our report that the business model of Facebook and Google is not only inherently incompatible with the right to privacy, because in order to access those platforms, you basically have to sign away that information. These platforms are not free. We pay with our very intimate personal data and our behavior online. But it's not just about the right to privacy. That initial abuse of the right to privacy allows other abuses to happen, specifically in relation to our freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, the right to equality and non-discrimination. And so when we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, it's really important to remember that the content that we see on social media is underpinned by this business model, which is designed to attract and keep people's attention for as long as possible in order to get the most engagement, clicks, views, shares, etc. And algorithms on Facebook determine what we see, on YouTube, algorithms on YouTube determine what videos we see, and Facebook and Twitter algorithms decide what we see on our feeds as well. And very often these algorithms amplify misinformation, disinformation, divisive content. They fuel racism. They spread very sort of sensationalist material. And so tackling misinformation, disinformation is going to require a mix of things. And some of the things that Jacquelyn mentioned are super important. So digital and media literacy, taking down content, but also being mindful that there is a risk there that if you take down too much content, then you then infringe on people's freedom of expression. Labeling tweets, and building the capacity of people to be able to be very critical about the information that you see. I think that's really, really important, but that only goes so far, right? And I think we'll continue to see this material spreading. We'll continue to see voters being dissuaded from voting. We'll continue to see lies about vaccines, etc. And abusive and hateful content spread very fast until we tackle the root causes of that content and the root causes of how that content spreads, which is essentially the business model. And so I think when it comes to figuring out, okay, so what do we do about it? We first have to recognize that companies like Facebook and Google have grown in such size and power and have such market dominance that they've been allowed to sort of avoid any kind of state regulation over that business model for a very, very long time. And it's not until we tackle that business model that we'll be able to then deal with these sort of systemic and root causes of hate speech, disinformation, and manipulation that we see flourish online. So what do we need to do? I can very clearly tell you what we should absolutely not do, which is we should not rely on the companies to self-regulate, because time after time, we've seen that self-regulation doesn't work. And so we absolutely need government regulation to step in and check the power of these big tech companies. And so I propose three main things. And no one of these things is enough in and of itself. It has to, I think it's about having a smart mix of structural solutions that are really going to get to the bottom of this. So first is that the ability of companies to gather so much data and use that information to target ads at people, I think has to be outlawed. And this could look like banning their ability to collect people's data, banning the ability for them to be able to target them with ads. And there are several discussions at the moment around banning targeted behavioral advertising, particularly in the EU. There's a coalition of MEPs that's essentially calling for this. So one of the things to tackle this issue could be banning targeted ads, but that's not enough, right? It needs that's not going to solve the whole problem. The second thing that needs to happen is modifying these recommendation algorithms, which are designed for automated amplification and audience targeting, and ensuring that these algorithms, one, are more transparent, that we know what they're dialing up the content on and what they're dialing down, ensuring that those algorithms deprioritize disinformation and incendiary content, just like Facebook did ahead of the US elections, and also giving users transparency about why they're seeing what they're seeing, and giving them more control of what they can see and what they don't want to see. And then finally, it's also about data protection. Now in the EU, we have very strong data protection regulations, the GDPR, but we need to ensure that those are actually effectively enforced. It's all good and well having very robust data protection frameworks, but really the devil is in the detail, and what's needed is to ensure that they are actually effectively implemented, and that people are able to get accountability for the ways in which their data is used and misused. And where there isn't strong data protection frameworks, we absolutely need to put those in place, because that will be a step towards safeguarding people's data and personal information. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Rasha. I saw furious nodding when you said self-regulation is not enough. So that's what I want to dive in on right now. And I think you raised so many really great practical interventions that can be made. I think there's also a discussion that we could have as well about governance at large. So a lot of regulation that's being proposed, aims to get at sort of one type of feature or way of working. And you raise a really good question about, is this whole business model flawed and problematic? Do we need an overhaul in how we're thinking about how the governance of our online spaces is structured? So I would invite the panelists now, we move into the more conversational part of this, to respond to any of that.
I mean, I would definitely agree. Certainly, I'm like a cat. I've had many professional lives, but in one of the iterations of me trying to look for a paycheck, I worked on AI regulation in the US, so at the federal level. And when we were looking at the Deepfakes Accountability Act, we really were getting to this question of how can we write statute that is going to regulate the internet, and came to what Rasha described as in terms of labeling. And the reason that we thought labeling would be a powerful first step was really raising the idea that there is misleading content online, because we're speaking about kind of 2017 through to 2019, and it seems really ridiculous now, but then, pre-Cambridge Analytica, the idea that the internet could be used to not tell us the truth was felt to be somewhat of a heresy. And then this recent article that's come out here in the US by Karen Ho at Tech Review, which was the culmination of what she says are over 24 interviews with Facebook within Facebook to find that Mark Zuckerberg, according to that incredible reporting, was always going to prioritize engagement. And so one of the case studies she looks at are the decisions made up into the lead of Myanmar. And the decision that was made, well, there were two decisions made within the company. Number one, that this AI ethics framing, which I rail against, because I think that, we have all of these frameworks and all of this racism, and let's get rid of the racism and the sexism and framework yourselves to death, but not at the expense of my humanity and my safety online. We need actual enforcement structures. But there was this decision to create an responsible AI framing within the company, but not to have a team that specifically went after hate speech. So as the situation got worse in Myanmar, there was literally nobody in the company to stop that. And that was by design, because what they're really interested in growth. So at that point, we have to really go to the business model. Is this a business model in which we can have not just human rights, but justice? And if you're coming from a justice framework, and we certainly, AI for the People, are a racial justice organization, we want to rip things down and start anew. We want to look at laws, policies, and practices that do not serve the weakest, whomever they are. So we don't have to experience an oppression to be in deep solidarity and to build power against that, to resist, right? That's our position. We are definitely in a space where we're thinking, well, is it antitrust? Is it not allowing transnational companies to exist? I mean, what levers can we pull to make sure that the information that we receive does in fact serve us? And how much more evidence do we need? And do we even need to be held hostage? I mean, these are very privileged thoughts, right? I'm Zambian. Some of my Zambian family have never forgiven me for because I stopped using Facebook, because that is their way into the internet. And so we're now having to think about, well, do you have Signal, and do you have these other platforms by which way I can communicate with you for free? But I'm definitely in deep support, and I definitely wouldn't believe anything that Jack or Sergey or Mark were telling me. I want justice, and I don't believe that they're not incentivized to provide that.
Yeah, totally agree that if we accept that these companies are doing harm, and we look at what they've tried to do already in terms of improving privacy or some form of content moderation or some kind of AI ethics, we're still seeing the harm. So clearly what they're doing hasn't gone far enough. And what is the thing that they haven't been willing to touch? It's the thing that's core to their business, this exploitation of data and targeted advertising. And essentially these other forms of intervention don't seem different from like lobbying, really, where if these companies are saying, we can take care of it ourselves, don't worry, and they have the ear of the policymakers, they're really just trying to kind of distract from what is the real issue here.
Yeah, I think I agree with the rest. I think there's enough evidence and analysis that's been done to confirm that, safeguards and regulation won't be enough unless we can imagine what equity actually looks like in these evolving digital spaces. I think a lot about Parler for a lot of reasons leading up to the election and the insurrection, and how things went down there, right? And how that freedom of speech space, that whether knowingly or not, I believe knowingly, allowed hateful, racist content to spread. And so you could attribute that to moderation guidelines, or you could blame Section 230 for removing, platform accountability. But for-profit organizations, I think, will always have the dollar in mind, because that's the nature of the operation. So if you could ever put a price tag on public interest, would that change the way you regulate and moderate? So that's how I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot about this, the question of enforcement of policies, because I think that when we when we look at just the policies of many platforms alone, you might read it and think, at least for some of these issues, might read it and think, yeah, that sounds good. And then you all are researchers who are, actually in looking at what's happening, and you're like, but this is not at all reflective of, there's a huge problem with enforcement, especially for non-English content, for example. And so I'm wondering, do you all think, I suppose it's never an either or, but how do you think about the question of enforcement of policies versus, regulation?
So I'm actually going through this right now in two ways. Personally, as somebody who's being attacked and having the privilege to access the platform, right? Most people have to make an in-platform complaint. I actually have the privilege of emailing a person who has enough power within the company who can look at my issue. And in initial conversations, even with Twitter, I found two things: legislative capture. So the person that I am speaking to is also somebody that had worked at the Congressional Black Caucus at the same time that I was doing work on the Hill, and was on my side at that point in terms of regulation, and is now in-house in the company protecting the very the very system that we were looking to overhaul only years later, and have taken those relationships into that space. So the number one. Number two, when we looked at content moderation and when we were looking at takedown, because AI for the People is a really, really small organization. Like, we roar loud on the internet, but there's actually not very many of us. But we work with larger partners, and our partner in our information integrity work, which is where our dis and misinformation work really lies, was moveon.org in the last election cycle. And so we were working with them and using their might really to force this conversation with platforms. And we found that not only are the content moderation was so focused on harm, like somebody actually had to be doxxed, or there had to be this bodily harm, that there wasn't this prevention, this harm reduction lens. And so we were legislating language that they had written to maintain engagement, which was incredibly frustrating. And then the third thing I would say is that racism is not seen as a harm. And that is something that when you are talking to people on platform, you really have to justify. And this isn't just hire more Black people, because it was Black people telling me that this wasn't a harm. And so it's like, what is a harm? Who has the right to be harmed? We were finding similar reports with, our comrades who are non-binary and trans, our comrades who are people living with disabilities, the most marginalized of the marginalized. We were told that this wasn't really a thing, which is just gaslighting by these huge, powerful companies, and you're dealing with these very, very small grassroots groups. And certainly in my research work, I have looked to these questions of what does it mean to have a racially literate tech sector where they understand that racism has a history, and it's really steeped in capitalistic gain. And so if you're dealing with capitalistic companies like Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and you're telling them the harm is rooted in this thing that I'm telling you, and they don't want to believe it, then there's the fragility that comes with me. I'm not racist. How could I possibly be racist? I mean, I have a whole report where people were coming back and telling us that they had voted for Barack Obama, which was really cool, but it wasn't on the survey. It wasn't on the survey. It was being used as a way to kind of deflect this idea that we were calling them racist, and then not having effective action planning, and allowing that one of the actions on the table should be burn this shit down. And, I could talk forever. I'm going to yield. I'm getting mad. But, there has to be a better way. We have to be able to have technology and have safe online spaces as well. I just refuse to yield that cannot be the case.
completely agree. I'll just jump in quickly to say that it's a false choice, right? To say that either we submit ourselves to pervasive surveillance online, or we can't access platforms like Google and Facebook. That's not a legitimate choice, and it's based on a very deliberate business decision by the companies themselves to maximize their profits. And I'm a firm believer in people power, and I think when it comes to enforcement of policies and when it comes to this radical rethink of the business model of the internet, rethinking and reimagining is only part of the work, right? The remaking, the actual doing is what's going to make the difference, and that's going to take time. It's going to take time, and it's going to take people power. Honestly, Amnesty. We did a poll in 10 countries in 2019, just after we launched our report, to look into how people feel about the corporate power, the power of big tech, and how their data is, how much their data is collected, and how it's used, and whether that concerns them. And 7 out of 10 people, this is from countries from all regions of the world, said that they felt concerned and uncomfortable about how much data is being collected about them and how that data is used. And a recent poll by Accountable Tech, 81% of Americans support banning companies from collecting their personal data and use that data to target them with ads. And they'd rather keep their personal data private, even if it means seeing less relevant ads. And so I think there is this momentum, there is this sort of awakening, this awareness building about the power of big tech. And people don't want the current model. They want a different model. And in order to create a different model that truly serves the people rather than the pockets of a few companies in Silicon Valley, we need to make sure that internet is designed by the people with meaningful collaboration and cooperation. And Mutale made a really good point earlier about the fact that in some parts of the world, Facebook is the internet. That is the internet. That's how people connect online. And where are those people? Where are those people in the debates about what a future rights-respecting data ecosystem should look like? They're not present anywhere, because the debate is being set by the powerful few, the powerful few Silicon Valley companies who set the limits on what is and what isn't acceptable in terms of privacy, in terms of interaction, in terms of content that we're allowed to see online. And that really needs a radical overhaul and a rethink, because we then leave people behind, and there is a disproportionate impact of the business model, data colonialism, data harvesting by people in the global south, and that has to change.
Thanks. And I think something that I picked up on that you talked about a little bit, Rasha, and also Mutale, you mentioned, was this idea that we need to do something, and also that there are people within the tech industry who are trying to make change for the better, or whose jobs are positioned as that they are attempting to intervene in some sense. So, and obviously this is in discussion a lot right now, and I know that a few of you are involved in the campaign launch of the No Tech for Tyrants Recruit Me Not campaign. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that movement, like what it means for ethics research within the tech industry itself, and really, like, I want to dig in on what should be the role of this kind of work, and in particular, what conditions are required for there to be genuine accountability coming out of the industry itself.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad that you gave a shout out to the Recruit Me Not campaign. I think it's such an important thing that's happening right now. I guess that there are 2 parts of this that Mutale and Rasha both touched on. One is the burn shit down, like how do we actually burn it down, and then what happens afterwards, like this envisioning of alternative techno futures. And I think that the revolution is not going to happen from AI ethicists in companies, and the revolution is not going to happen from AI regulators. But as Rasha points out, there's a lot of potential here for collective action. Like 81%, I hadn't heard that statistic, but that's incredible. 81% of people in the United States thinking that data collection should be banned. This isn't like a Republican versus Democrat issue. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for unlikely coalitions across party lines in the United States. And to come back a little bit to the question you asked about enforcement, like I think that regulatory enforcement it's not going to be enough, because these movements like the No Tech for Tyrants and their Recruit Me Not campaign, they're an example of the type of collective action that both helps hold governments accountable when they're not, you know, doing the enforcement part, and holds companies accountable when they're just doing what they do. And we've seen these type of campaigns succeed in the past. With Project Maven at Google, there was a huge tech worker uprising around that. That was also coupled with the public campaign. Also, the sexual harassment issues at Google that were happening from the tech executives not being held accountable. Again, the Google walkout for change led to, you know, a big conversation there. And so what this current campaign, the Recruit Me Not campaign, is doing is focus on this issue of Timnit Gebru's dismissal on, you know, completely bogus grounds of she was basically publishing a paper that said AI bias still exists, wow, and machine learning has climate impacts. And, you know, I guess Google said you can't keep publishing this stuff, so you got to go. As you know, which is another brilliant example of why this AI ethics within companies is just like, it's just policy lobbying. And so what the Recruit Me Not campaign is doing is saying, you know, Google, you're not going to get away with this. And one way that anyone who's a tech worker or a student or a researcher can help put pressure on them is by saying, we're not going to work at Google until you listen to the Google walkout for change folks who aren't making unreasonable demands. You know, they're asking for more transparency in the review process at Google. They're asking to, you know, reveal what exactly happened. And if Google can meet these demands, which by all means, you know, it should be able to, then you know, you can go work for Google again, even if you've taken the pledge. But yeah, check it out, Recruit Me Not.
The other thing I would also say about the Recruit Me Not campaign is that, at least from the people that I've seen, it's tending to be women. It's tending to be women of color. And they are in, the launch was between Cambridge University and Edinburgh University, which are two elite academic spaces. So they're also within Google-like, Facebook-like environments already, right? And these people are doing this at great personal risk. And I think the reason, this idea of cutting tech off at the source was really brilliant to me, because I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review, probably, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, who knows, with COVID. It was when we could go outside and before times. And one of the things that I talked about were how companies have to really think about social corporate responsibility within AI ethics, about really changing society, really thinking about, well, which politicians are you, which PACs are you recruiting to, right? And what harm are those PACs doing? Which nonprofits are you recruiting to? And are you creating a better society, or are you just, you know, instead of overhauling the education system, you're just giving more books that you publish, right? So let's really think about this reimagining. And so much of AI for the People's work is in the imagination space, using art and culture to create new possibilities through story for people who are new to the issues or don't care about the issues. And that's certainly something that we did with our disinformation work. We were really passionate about we did publish a paper because we were researchers, but we also created a series of videos and then measured video engagement with pro-voting, pro-social messages against engagement with the Don't Vote hashtag. And guess what? Black Joy won. People actually wanted to have a reason to do something. The disinformation messages were really crazy. And then when we went back to local news ecosystems and were able to do headline analysis, we're showing how the way that they were covering disinformation was an issue. But that aside, with No Tech for Tyrants, what they're doing is really changing this story about why people want to get into tech, what they want to do when they get there, and for all the diversity and inclusion, nonsense, like theater that these companies engage with, they wouldn't even really have that supply. And I thought it was incredibly important to use Timnit Gebru's story, Michelle Mitchell's story, and Alex Hanna, who is a trans researcher who is still in the belly of the beast doing the great work of resisting from within right now as we speak, I'm sure under intense pressure, and giving these students another way of being. And so much of the time I was at that launch trying to engage in an opportunity, in a conversation about alternative tech futures. So what is public interest technology? Who can be in it? How can we be in it? One of the things, Rasha and I are presently collaborating on a project, but our teams worked really closely together in the launch of a different body of work that we're involved in. But one of the things that really impressed me about that were, here was this racial justice, female-led, not very well funded. So foundation, shout out, you could be doing more, just saying, holler at your girl. But but one of the things that she was able to do was use her institutional power to listen to critiques that we had about the way Amnesty and rights organizations work. And not only listen to critiques, but create space for leadership. And then I was able to take that back to the No Tech, the Recruit Me Nots, and say, there are alternative places that you can work. And we have to keep building this area of public interest tech, so that there are places that people can go. And certainly for the people that work with me, it would be my honor and pleasure if somebody were to apply to an Amnesty and then be looked at and recruited based on the work that we had already done with that company, and really be a trusted recruitment pipeline. I can't imagine that people would want to work with me, would run to Google, but who knows? I'm not in the business of training people to become cogs. I'm in the business of training people to make meaningful and radical change, and go to apply to programs like yours, Professor Krafft. We would love to take undergraduates that would then be have that theoretical background as well, because we're not going to have a new sector. We're not going to have a public interest sector if we don't have people who are trained and held and safely held, and then paid as if they were at a tech company as well. Because I had a huge conversation around how you should still be able to be paid in the way that you were in these other spaces for doing this work.
Thank you. I want to raise a question that we got from the audience on Twitter, which I think is related. I think one of the things I loved that you were talking about, Mutale, was this idea that in order to create public interest tech, we're going to need more people from more spaces, and maybe even outside of just technologists or people who consider themselves to be technologists. So this question that we got speaks to that. So someone on Twitter asked, what actions can non-technologists take to counteract harmful AI? And I think related to this, I wanted to sneak in another question, because I'm like looking at the time, about one of the things I wanted to ask was around also kind of community-based solutions to misinformation. I think possibly there's a link here, but you all can tell me if I'm right there.
Great. So, much of today's information disorder has been designed to undermine like a lot of our basic values, our systemic values, in trust in institutions, trust in the sciences, and misinformation has built this kind of identity-based narratives that can pit communities and community members against one another. So I was just thinking, for instance, the recent rise of Asian American violence across the US has been used to create rifts between the Asian American community and the Black community in some spaces online. And so most of the content proliferating about incidents like these might not be picked up by an algorithm or possibly even flagged as mis or disinformation, as much of it falls into this kind of gray area that algorithms might currently have issues with tracking. So it's important that those who work with and identify as community leaders understand how certain types of disinformation is being weaponized against them daily. So basically at First Draft, where I work, which is a nonprofit dedicated to tackling disinformation globally, we've been working closely with the Disinformation Defense League, which is a collective of over 200 grassroots organizations fighting mis and disinformation in Black and Latinx communities. And knowing that newsrooms and tech lack the diversity and often do not represent the communities that they are meant to serve, this community intervention is key. And we have been working with community leaders and training the trainer to be able to identify propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. And so they, in turn, develop organizational strategies to tackle disinformation that is then shared with their network. So I just think, as far as systemic change, a big problem in the creation of these algorithms is that people from BIPOC communities' voices are not included. Appreciating the nuances and characteristics of these communities, like seeing through people that we work with, is critical for anyone who studies, funds, or works on technology, trying to temper information disorder online. And so that's why I think working with people on the ground and having them in turn work with people within their communities is the best way, in my opinion, to solve our current crisis.
AI for the people. I'm a journalist, 20 years in the game, Black don't crack. And I've been a member of the National Association of Black Journalists for all of that time. So we started out with just old friends and have been working with NABJ last year through their conference, looking at disinformation and presenting, and have lots of exciting projects once we get them off the ground that will be looking into those marketplaces, as well as looking at opinion as well. Because one of the things that we found, certainly with our report, where the ADOS network were able to then use the opinion pages as kind of an entryway in. So we've been speaking to some funders around looking at that. And then really we piloted last year a micro influencer program, because just in internal conversations, we were really excited that Kendall Jenner could sell lip gloss using her platform, using her influence. And we piloted in Philadelphia in the run up to the election, a political micro influencer program, which was really, really successful. So we're beginning to think about going into cities and looking at ethnic local media ecosystems that we're already connected with, and getting over this idea that journalists have to be objective by bringing in non-journalistic actors who are trusted voices within communities, who perhaps would see themselves outside of the Disinformation League or those types of big coalitions where it's like hundreds and they want something a little bit more intimate, smaller, and working with them. So kind of piloting, but I do agree that all solutions are local. And I don't even know, even being a policymaker coming from that world, policy isn't going to change the conditions of people. Movements are going to change the conditions of people. And, this past year, we had started to really work with the New Georgia Project on like questions of disinformation. And one of the things that Insane Foot, who's the CEO there and a close friend, always said to me throughout the 2020 election, she was like, Mutale, women didn't get the right to vote because men decided it was time. It was because of the suffrage movement. and Black women were part of that. So always lean into culture, lean into movement. And when we're speaking in Black and brown places, that also means leaning into film, into television, into other ways of pricking the cultural conversation in a way that's going to resonate. And we're seeing that in the work that we did with Amnesty wasn't on disinformation. It was looking at biometrics, but the creation of we create a film together, which we're traveling all over the country. And every time we do policy briefings, we're doing hundreds and hundreds of policy briefings. The policymakers come back to us and they ask us about the story of the people in the video. And the fact that Amnesty put their stamp on it gives it that other level of credibility, but it's through those stories that we're able to either support legislation and in some cases say, this legislation really needs to be changed because this person in the video would not have been protected. And it just really lowers the bar, and I think really lowers the temperature, because in the communities in which we in which we're well networked and we're drawing on like decades of relationships, just saying the word algorithm, completely switch off. Nobody wants to talk to you.
If I can just quickly say a few concrete actions that as Mutale mentioned, everything's very local, and so it really depends where you are. If you're in Europe or the UK, learn about your data rights and make requests for your data and file complaints to the Information Commissioner when you see like cookies that are bad. If you're in Seattle, you can make public comments on their surveillance technologies. There's just an article out about Acyclica, one of the surveillance technologies last week. Use Linux and free software if you're not already. And what I would say, if there's a single thing I would recommend to everyone, as Mutale says, this is about collective action. So join a trade union, but don't just join, get involved in casework, get involved in organizing. We need to build counterpower, and I'll be ready.
And one final thing from me, just very much related to that. Amnesty is going to be launching a campaign on the issue of the business model of big tech. Hopefully in the summer, we'll have something on our website that people can get involved in. But please talk to your family about it, talk to your friends about it, and get involved with Amnesty. If in your country, if you have an Amnesty section, get involved and come on board this mission with us to make a rights respecting internet that is made for society rather than for the pockets of Silicon Valley.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, that is our dialogues and debates for today. So thank you all so much for being here. And to everyone online, thank you for tuning in.